In a castle where even the walls breathe cold, they became each other's forbidden warmth. This is a story of how a stray touch in the dark shatters every frozen mask of the past. Our story is unfolding right at this moment. The northern wind did not merely blow across the jagged peaks surrounding the Durmstrang Institute, it clawed. It tore mercilessly at the heavy woolen cloaks of the Hogwarts 8th year delegation as they ascended the steep, ice-carved steps toward the fortress. For Hermione Granger, the biting cold was a stark, physical reminder of how far she was from the familiar warmth of Scotland, from the lingering ghosts of a war she was desperate to leave behind. She paused on the precipice of the grand entrance, her fingers trembling inside her dragon-hide gloves. It was not entirely the glacial temperature that caused the tremor in her hands, but the suffocating atmospheric pressure of the ancient, imposing stronghold looming above them. The dark stone walls seemed to absorb the meager twilight, bleeding heavy shadows onto the snow-packed earth. Deep in the pocket of her cloak, her fingertips nervously grazed the tooth of old parchment. A letter folded and refolded a dozen times over the past month. A letter from Victor. Stepping across the threshold, the transition from the screaming gale outside to the oppressive silence of the entrance hall was a jarring impact. The heavy oak doors groaned shut behind them, sealing the Hogwarts students inside. As they moved deeper into the fortress, the hollow echo of footsteps in a vacant corridor amplified the unspoken anxiety among the displaced youth. Durmstrang did not welcome. It observed. The air here was thick, carrying the sharp scent of pine sap and the faint metallic tang of ozone after a hex, a scent that seemed permanently baked into the very marrow of the castle's stones. Hermione's chest tightened. She reached instinctively to adjust the collar of her robes, a sudden, frantic need to straighten her already perfect sleeve cuffs overwhelming her. It was a nervous habit, a physical manifestation of the sudden, erratic rhythm of her heart. She was seeking sanctuary here, a quiet, rigorous exchange program to focus on ancient runes and restorative magic. A place where she was not half of the Golden Trio, but simply a student. Keep moving, Granger, unless you intend to take root and sprout leaves in the middle of the foyer. The voice was a low, aristocratic drawl, devoid of its childhood cruelty, but still possessing the razor-sharp edge of sheared glass. Hermione did not flinch, but a sudden static charged the air at the nape of her neck. She glanced over her shoulder. Draco Malfoy stood a few paces behind her, his pale, angular features stark and unreadable against the luxurious dark fur of his cloak collar. He was a portrait of rigid stillness. He offered no complaints about the cold, no sneers at the foreign architecture. He merely endured, his jaw locked in a severe line. As her eyes met his thumb deliberately dragged over the sharp edge of the silver signet ring on his right hand. He pressed it inward, utilizing the sharp bite of a silver ring against skin as a physical anchor to keep his expression entirely blank. He didn't look away. He rarely did these days. Gone were the sneers and the taunts, replaced by a dark, heavy observation that made Hermione's breath catch shallow in her lungs. There was a visceral alignment in the way they existed in the same space now. Two survivors of the same wreckage, standing on opposite sides of a chasm they refused to acknowledge. "I am moving, Malfoy," she murmured, her voice tight, immediately turning her back to him to sever the visual connection. Yet the magnetic pull of his presence followed her like a second shadow as they were ushered into the great hall of Durmstrang. The hall was a cavernous expanse of dark mahogany and wrought iron, lit by hundreds of floating candles that cast a warm, flickering amber glow over the austere room. The Durmstrang students stood in immaculate, disciplined rows by their long tables. And there, standing taller and broader than the rest, was Victor Krum. Hermione's breath hitched, a genuine, relieved smile finally breaking through the mask of tension she had worn since boarding the ship. He looked older, the angles of his face hardened by time and fame, but as his dark eyes locked onto hers across the expanse of the hall, they held that same familiar, unyielding warmth. He was a hearth fire in a freezing room. He was a memory of a time before the world had fractured. Protocol dictated they wait for the headmasters to speak, but Victor, never one to bow completely to convention when his heart was set, broke formation. His heavy, fur-lined boots sounded a rhythmic, purposeful beat against the stone floor as he crossed the room. Hermione stepped forward, her earlier anxieties melting away. When he reached her, there was no hesitation. He didn't offer his hand. He enveloped her in a sudden, crushing embrace. "Hermione!" His voice was a deep, resonant rumble against her ear, laced with a thick Bulgarian accent that instantly brought a flush to her cheeks. "Victor," she breathed out, burying her face briefly in the wool of his uniform. The tactile friction of his rough, seeker-calloused hands, gently pulling back to cup her shoulders, was entirely grounding. He was solid. He was safe. He was an uncomplicated affection that demanded nothing but her presence. "You are freezing," he murmured, his thumb brushing a stray curl from her cheek. "Come, sit with me. I have saved a place." She nodded, allowing him to guide her by the waist toward the center table. It was exactly what she wanted. It was exactly what she had traveled hundreds of miles to find. But as she sat down, the warmth of Victor's solid frame beside her was violently contested by a localized storm brewing across the aisle. The Hogwarts delegation was taking their seats at the adjacent table. Draco Malfoy claimed a spot directly in her line of sight. He did not speak to Theodore Nott, who sat beside him. He did not look at the elaborate spread of roasted meats and dark breads materializing on the silver platters. He sat perfectly upright, a statue carved from permafrost, and stared directly at where Victor's hand rested casually over Hermione's on the table. Hermione felt the shift in the atmosphere before she even looked at him. The air between their tables grew thick, heavy with an unspoken, suffocating weight. Even with her hand enveloped in Victor's comforting grasp, she couldn't stop the involuntary turn of her head. Malfoy's eyes flicked up from her hand to her face. Silver pierced through the dim, smoky air, striking her with the force of a physical blow. Beneath the heavy oak table, hidden from the rest of the hall, Draco's knuckles were whitening as he gripped the edge of the wood with punishing force. There was no theatrical anger in his posture, no dramatic scowl. There was only a quiet, violent intensity, a starving, hollow look that stripped away the ambient noise of the great hall. Hermione swallowed hard, suddenly hyper-aware of Victor's thumb tracing the back of her knuckles. Every brush of Victor's skin felt magnified, scrutinized by the boy across the room, who looked as though he was silently tearing himself apart from the inside out. Draco's gaze traced the line of her throat, the flush on her cheeks, and then flicked back to Victor. The silence stretching between Hermione and Draco was deafening, a taut wire pulled to its absolute snapping point. She wanted to look away. She needed to focus on the man beside her who was openly offering her the world. But as the welcoming feast began, and the hall filled with the clamour of hundreds of voices, Hermione remained paralysed by the storm in silver eyes, trapped in the crossfire of a warmth she desperately wanted to accept, and a cold she inexplicably could not ignore. The Durmstrang Library was a cavern of secrets, entirely devoid of the welcoming sunlit dust motes that Hermione so dearly loved at Hogwarts. Here, the architecture was carved directly into the mountain's bedrock. Narrow, arched windows lined the high walls, letting in only the bruised purple light of the northern afternoon, while the sprawling lower levels were illuminated by floating spheres of pale blue-tinted witchlight. The scent of the place was intensely ancient, a heavy mixture of damp stone, the tooth of old parchment, and the metallic, bitter tang of preservation spells that had held for centuries. For the first 3 days of the exchange, Hermione had used the library as a fortress against the overwhelming atmospheric pressure of the foreign school. More specifically, she used it to anchor herself to Victor. He had sat beside her at a heavy ironwood table near the hearth, his large frame acting as a shield against the biting draughts. His presence was steady, his low voice murmuring translations of Cyrillic runes when she stumbled over them. It was a comfortable, easy rhythm. It was exactly what she told herself she needed. But Victor had been summoned to the dueling rings by the Durmstrang headmaster an hour ago, leaving Hermione alone in the sprawling, shadowy silence of the northern wing. She stared down at her essay on advanced restorative enchantments, her quill suspended over the parchment. The ink had dried on the nib. She was not reading the text. She was listening. The hollow echo of footsteps in a vacant corridor drifted from the adjacent aisle. The sound was measured, deliberate, and entirely lacking the heavy, booted weight of the native Durmstrang students. A sudden tremor ran through Hermione's fingers. She sharply placed the quill down and engaged in a frantic need to straighten her already perfect sleeve cuffs, smoothing the dark wool of her robes as if preparing for a duel. Draco Malfoy rounded the tall bookcase, stopping short when he saw her. He was out of his heavy winter cloak, wearing merely the stark black trousers and crisp white shirt of the Hogwarts uniform, his green and silver tie loosened slightly at his throat. The shadows of the library clung to the sharp angles of his face, accentuating the dark, bruised circles beneath his silver eyes. For a fraction of a second, his guard faltered. A raw, visceral hunger flared in his gaze, tearing across the space between them before he brutally slammed the iron doors of his occlumency back into place. He did not turn around and leave, though every line of his rigid posture suggested he wanted to. Professor Vane, the ruthless instructor overseeing the exchange academics, had mandated mixed school pairs for the overarching term project, but had maliciously paired the Hogwarts students together for the preliminary translations, claiming they needed to prove their foundational worth before touching Durmstrang texts. Malfoy was her assigned partner. Draco moved toward the table, the atmospheric pressure in the room immediately dropping by several degrees. He set his leather satchel down with a soft, muted thud and pulled out an unforgivingly thick grimoire bound in dark, scaled leather. He did not say a word as he took the seat opposite her. The silence between them was not the comfortable quiet she shared with Victor. It was a living, breathing entity. It was an agonizing stretch of static. "I have translated the first 3 chapters of the blood-mending rites," Hermione finally said, her voice sounding unnervingly loud in the cavernous space. She slid a piece of parchment across the table. "You need to cross-reference the arithmancy equations on page 42. Draco didn't look at her face. He kept his eyes locked firmly on the parchment as he reached out to pull it closer. His long, pale fingers brushed against the edge of the paper, stopping mere inches from hers. The magnetic pull of his proximity was intoxicating, radiating a cold heat that made the fine hairs on Hermione's arms stand up. "The variable for the lunar phase is miscalculated here," Draco murmured, his voice a low, raspy vibration that seemed to bypass her ears and hum directly in her chest. He withdrew a silver quill from his pocket, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the delicate instrument. He slashed a sharp line through her neat handwriting. "If you cast the countercurse with this ratio, you wouldn't mend the tissue, you would liquefy the marrow." Hermione bristled, the sudden spike of indignation an easy, familiar shield against the terrifying flutter in her stomach. "I accounted for the Northern Hemisphere's axial tilt, Malfoy. The equation is perfectly sound." "It is sound for a standard healing charm, Granger. This is Durmstrang magic." He finally lifted his head, his silver eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in his stare was a jarring impact, a physical weight that pinned her to her chair. "It requires sacrifice, a magical toll. You haven't factored in the decay." "Then show me," she challenged, leaning forward slightly, refusing to be cowed by the sudden, intense narrowing of his eyes. Draco's jaw clenched. He slid the heavy grimoire to the center of the table between them. The book was massive, requiring them both to lean in to read the minuscule, faded script. As Hermione shifted closer, the scent of ozone after a hex wafted from the enchanted pages, mixing intimately with the crisp, clean scent of peppermint and cedar that clung to Draco's skin. He pointed the feathered end of his quill at a complex diagram. "Here. The anchor rune." Hermione leaned further in, trying to follow the sharp lines of ink. In her attempt to get a better view under the dim witchlight, her shoulder brushed against his. It was the briefest point of contact. Nothing more than the heavy wool of her sweater grazing the fine cotton of his shirt, but the tactile friction sent a violent shockwave through them both. Draco froze entirely. The air vanished from the space around them. Hermione stopped breathing, her eyes darting from the ancient text to the pale column of his throat, watching the frantic, heavy swallow that bobbed against his collar. She could feel the heat radiating from his arm, a stark contrast to the freezing environment of the castle. For one suspended, agonizing second, neither of them pulled away. The visceral alignment of their bodies leaning over the same forgotten magic created an entirely new, terrifying spell of its own. Slowly, agonizingly, Draco turned his face toward hers. They were mere inches apart. She could see the faint, silvery scar tearing through his left eyebrow, the subtle tremor in his lower lip. His eyes were wide, stripped entirely of the cold, aristocratic mask he wore for the world. In the depths of his gaze, Hermione saw a torrential war, a desperate, starving need violently clashing with a crushing, paralyzing terror. His gaze dropped to her mouth. The static in the air snapped and cracked. Hermione's lips parted on a shallow, unsteady exhale, her heart violently hammering against her ribs. She was leaning in. She didn't know how, she didn't know why, but the magnetic pull was dragging her irrevocably closer to the boy she was supposed to despise. The thought of Victor, solid, warm, steady Victor, evaporated entirely into the ether, burned away by the consuming heat of Draco Malfoy's stare. His right hand twitched on the table. He lifted it, his fingers curling inward as if fighting the instinctive urge to touch her cheek. The sharp bite of his silver ring pressed deeply into the wood of the table as he anchored his hand down, anchoring himself against the tide of his own desire. Then, the emotional shift hit with the force of an avalanche. The vulnerability in his eyes shattered, replaced instantly by a glacial, unyielding panic. He recoiled violently, his chair scraping against the stone floor with a harsh, grating screech that shattered the silence of the library. Hermione flinched, snapping backward as if she had been slapped. Draco stood up, his chest heaving under his white shirt, though his face had been wiped entirely blank. The temperature in the room plummeted, the oppressive cold of Durmstrang rushing back in to fill the space his warmth had just vacated. "Figure the rest of the variables out yourself, Granger," he spat, his voice laced with a brittle, defensive cruelty. He didn't bother packing his satchel. He simply turned on his heel. "I have no interest in wasting my afternoon watching you butcher elementary dark arts theory." "Malfoy?" Hermione started, her voice a fragile, broken whisper. He didn't stop. The hollow echo of his rapid, retreating footsteps rang through the vacant corridor, leaving Hermione sitting alone in the suffocating gloom. She stared at the empty chair across from her, her hands trembling so violently she had to press them flat against the cold ironwood table to hide the tremor. Her lips still burned from the proximity of his breath. Her skin still hummed from the tactile friction of his arm against hers. She closed her eyes, a heavy, suffocating wave of guilt washing over her. She was supposed to be safe here. She was supposed to be with Victor. But as she sat in the dark, breathing in the lingering scent of cedar and ozone, she knew with terrifying certainty that the fortress she had built around her heart was already beginning to fracture. The ice stretching across the black lake of Durmstrang was not the smooth, glassy surface Hermione was accustomed to in Scotland. It was jagged, fractured, and opaque, mirroring the turbulent, unresolved state of her own mind. The northern wind howled a low, mournful dirge through the towering pine forests that bordered the water, whipping loose snow into swirling phantoms that danced across the frozen expanse. She walked beside Victor, his large, fur-clad arm wrapped securely around her shoulders, shielding her from the worst of the gale. He was a bastion of heat against the biting chill. He was everything she had promised herself she needed, uncomplicated, fiercely loyal, and entirely present. Yet, as his heavy boots crunched rhythmically against the snow, Hermione felt a deep, sickening hollow opening in her chest. She was committing a silent betrayal. Every time Victor's rough, calloused thumb brushed the side of her arm, her traitorous mind replaced the sensation with the ghost of a different touch. She could not scrub the memory of the library from her skin. The tactile friction of Draco Malfoy's arm grazing hers had burned an invisible brand into her nerve endings. She was horrified by her own body's betrayal, by the involuntary tremor that raced down her spine at the mere thought of silver eyes stripped of their customary cruelty. "You are quiet today, Moja Zvezda," Victor murmured, the deep, resonant timbre of his voice vibrating through the thick wool of his coat. He pulled her a fraction closer, his dark eyes scanning her face with a gentleness that only sharpened the blade of her guilt. "Your mind is back in the library, with the books." Hermione forced a smile, a sudden, frantic need to straighten her already perfect sleeve cuffs, overtaking her as she pulled her hand from her pocket. She adjusted the dark fabric over her wrists, refusing to meet his gaze directly. Just mulling over the blood-mending rites. The arithmetic is incredibly complex. Professor Vane expects a flawless translation by Monday. Victor stopped walking. The wind whipped a stray, dark curl across his forehead. He reached out, his large hands gently framing her face. The warmth of his palms was a stark contrast to the glacial air, but as Hermione looked up into his earnest, heavy-lidded eyes, the static that should have sparked between them was entirely absent. "It is not just the runes," Victor said quietly. It wasn't a question. He was a seeker. His entire life was predicated on observing the minute, imperceptible shifts in his environment. "There is a heaviness, an atmospheric pressure around you lately. It changes when the blonde boy is in the room." Hermione's heart slammed against her ribs, a jarring impact that momentarily stole her breath. She opened her mouth to deny it, to weave a logical, perfectly structured argument about the hostility between former enemies. But the words died on her tongue. Victor's gaze held no anger, only a quiet, sorrowful observation. "Malfoy and we have a complicated history, Victor. You know this," she managed to whisper, the truth fracturing as it left her lips. "I know history," Victor replied, his thumb brushing a snowflake from her cheek. "I also know what it looks like when two people are fighting a war they pretend does not exist." He dropped his hands, the loss of his warmth leaving her shivering. "Do not let the shadows of that castle drag you back into the dark, Hermione." He offered his arm again and she took it, but the walk back to the fortress was steeped in a suffocating silence. The trust he was so freely offering felt heavy, a burden she was increasingly terrified she could not carry. The following afternoon, the physical manifestation of that shadow found them in the central courtyard. The sky was the color of a bruised plum, the heavy clouds threatening another massive snowfall. Professor Vane had dragged the 8th-year cohort outside for a practical demonstration of defensive wards against elemental dark magic. Hermione stood next to Victor, her wand drawn, her breath misting in the freezing air. Across the cobblestone yard, Draco Malfoy stood rigidly beside Theodore Nott. Malfoy was devoid of a heavy cloak, wearing only his dark uniform robes, seemingly impervious to the biting cold. Or, perhaps, he simply refused to acknowledge it. Since his panicked flight from the library, he had become an impenetrable fortress of ice. He did not look at her during meals. He did not occupy the same corridors. But now, forced into the same perimeter, the magnetic pull between them snapped into existence with violent immediacy. Shielding against a localized blizzard hex requires absolute focus, Professor Vane barked, pacing between the mixed groups of Durmstrang and Hogwarts students. Your core must be anchored. If your mind wavers, the frost will turn your blood to glass. Crumb, demonstrate with Granger. Hermione stepped into the center of the ring, her boots slipping slightly on the slick stones. Victor moved opposite her, his wand raised respectfully. He cast the hex with a sharp, fluid motion of his wrist. A concentrated blast of swirling, razor-sharp ice roared toward her. "Protego Maxima!" Hermione shouted. A shimmering, golden dome erupted from her wand, catching the brunt of the attack. But her mind was not anchored. As the ice slammed into her shield, her eyes darted involuntarily across the courtyard. Draco was watching her. He was standing perfectly still, but the aristocratic mask had slipped. His jaw was locked so tightly she could see the muscles ticking beneath his pale skin. He was watching Victor's magic rush toward her, his knuckles whitening as he gripped his own wand with punishing, bone-snapping force. He looked half a second away from tearing across the courtyard and putting himself between her and the spell, driven by an instinct he was violently trying to suppress. The visceral alignment of their gazes through the swirling snow shattered her concentration. Her shield flickered. "Granger! Focus!" Vane yelled. The icy blast broke through the weakening barrier, the edge of the spell grazing Hermione's shoulder. The sheer force of the cold was an intense shock, sending her stumbling backward onto the hard cobblestones. Instantly, Victor was there, dropping his wand and catching her before she hit the ground entirely. "Hermione, forgive me. I put too much power into it." "I'm fine. I just lost my footing," she gasped, her shoulder throbbing with a burning, unnatural cold. Across the courtyard, a sharp, cracking sound echoed through the air. The heavy stone gargoyle perched on the balustrade nearest to Draco exploded into a shower of dust and gravel. The scent of ozone after a hex immediately flooded the courtyard, bitter and metallic. Silence fell over the students. Every head turned toward Malfoy. His wand was raised, the tip still smoking slightly. His chest heaved once, a massive, jagged inhale, before he lowered his arm with agonizing slowness. He did not look at the destroyed statue. He looked only at the spot where Victor's hands were currently wrapped around Hermione's waist, helping her to her feet. "Control your magic, Mr. Malfoy," Vane hissed, his eyes narrowing. "Or I will have you expelled from this exchange before nightfall." Draco didn't answer the professor. His eyes, dark and stormy, remained fixed on Hermione. The atmospheric pressure in the courtyard had compressed into something thick and unbreathable. He was bleeding from the inside out, his internal guilt and suppressed terror manifesting as raw, destructive energy. He was punishing himself for the very thought of wanting her, and the sight of her in Crumb's arms was tearing at the hastily stitched seams of his sanity. Slowly, he turned his right hand inward. He pressed the sharp bite of a silver ring against his palm, a grounding mechanism, a self-inflicted pain to distract from the agonizing ache in his chest. He held her gaze for one more excruciating second, a silent, desperate communication that she felt in the very marrow of her bones, before he turned his back on the group and stalked away into the shadowed archways of the castle. The hollow echo of footsteps in a vacant corridor was the only sound left in his wake. "Are you injured?" Victor asked, his voice pulling her back to reality. Hermione shook her head, though her hands were shaking. The The cold biting at her shoulder was nothing compared to the icy dread pooling in her stomach. She realized then, with absolute terrifying clarity, that she was not just observing a storm from a safe distance. She was standing in the center of it, and the lightning had already struck. She needed to find him. As soon as the practical lesson was dismissed, Hermione did not wait for Victor. She muttered a hasty excuse about visiting the hospital wing for a warming draught and sprinted toward the archway where Malfoy had vanished. The corridors of Durmstrang were labyrinthine, lit only by sputtering torches that cast long, monstrous shadows against the walls. She navigated the twisting passages by instinct alone, seeking the faint, lingering scent of the tooth of old parchment and raw magic. She found him on a secluded, open-air balcony overlooking the sheer drop of the mountain. The wind was ferocious here, whipping his dark robes violently around his legs. He was gripping the stone balustrade, leaning forward over the precipice as if contemplating the fall. Malfoy. He went entirely rigid. He did not turn around. "Go back to your Bulgarian, Granger," he rasped, his voice barely carrying over the howl of the wind. It was not a sneer. It was an exhausted, hollow plea. She stepped out onto the balcony, the biting cold slicing through her uniform. "What happened in the courtyard? You shattered solid stone." "I lost control of a basic severing charm," he lied, his fingers digging into the dark stone. "It happens. You are an exceptional duelist. You don't lose control unless you are entirely unmoored." She took another step closer, the invisible tether dragging her into his orbit despite the screaming alarms in her head. "Why did you run away in the library? Why do you look at me like you're starving, and then look at me like you wish I were dead?" He finally turned. The mask was gone. The aristocratic restraint he had perfected was completely dismantled, leaving behind a raw, broken boy. His eyes were entirely silver, reflecting the turbulent clouds above. "Because I am a blight," he breathed out, the words ripped from his throat. He closed the distance between them in 3 long strides, stopping inches from her face. The air between them exploded into a chaotic frenzy of suppressed desire and blinding terror. "Because every time I let myself look at you, I want to drag you into the dark with me. And you belong in the light, Granger. You belong with the idiot who plays a game for a living, who doesn't carry shadows that bleed into everything he touches." Hermione's breath hitched. She stared up at him, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Their proximity was undeniable. She could feel the heat radiating from him, fighting a desperate war against the freezing wind. "You don't get to decide where I belong," she whispered fiercely, a sudden, fierce defiance flaring to life within her. Draco let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He reached out, his hand trembling violently, stopping just a millimeter away from the curve of her jaw. The heat of his skin against the freezing air was intoxicating. "If I touch you," he murmured, his eyes dropping to her lips, "I won't stop, and it will destroy us both." Before she could answer, before she could lean into that agonizing millimeter of space, he pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. The emotional shift hit with brutal force. He retreated, his eyes hardening into twin chips of ice. The warmth he had offered for a split second was extinguished, replaced by a suffocating, unbearable cold. "Stay away from me, Granger," he commanded softly, stepping back into the shadows. For your own sake. He turned and disappeared back into the dark corridors of the castle, leaving Hermione alone on the balcony. The wind howled around her, but the loudest sound in her ears was the frantic, shattered beating of her own heart. She wrapped her arms around herself, the cold seeping into her very bones, hopelessly trapped between the light she was supposed to walk toward and the beautiful, terrifying darkness that had just demanded her absence. The ensuing days wrapped Durmstrang in a suffocating shroud of perpetual twilight. Heavy snowfalls blocked the narrow, arched windows, forcing the castle to rely entirely on the erratic, flickering amber glow of enchanted sconces and the pale blue witchlight spheres hovering in the corridors. For Hermione, the dimness was a physical manifestation of her own clouded judgment. She sat by the roaring hearth in the foreign students' common room, her knees pulled to her chest, a thick woolen blanket draped over her shoulders. Victor sat on the rug near her feet, his attention focused on polishing the handle of his broomstick with slow, methodical strokes. The scent of beeswax and old wood drifted upward, a grounding, earthy aroma that usually settled her racing thoughts. Tonight, however, it offered no comfort. The firelight painted warm, copper hues across Victor's strong jaw, highlighting the steadfast reliability that had drawn her to him in the first place. He was entirely present. He was unguarded, and she was utterly, devastatingly hollow. A profound sense of betrayal gnawed at the edges of her conscience. It was a quiet, insidious guilt. She was not betraying him with actions, but with the treacherous, unstoppable wandering of her own mind. Every time she closed her eyes, the flames in the hearth did not remind her of Gryffindor common rooms or Victor's warm embrace. They mirrored the volatile, starved intensity she had seen in Silver eyes on a freezing, wind-swept balcony. "The snow will not stop until Sunday," Victor murmured, his deep voice breaking the heavy silence. He did not look up from the bristles of his broom, but the cadence of his tone was too carefully measured. "The headmaster has cancelled the outdoor dueling drills. We will be in the alchemy dungeons instead." Hermione's fingers convulsed in the folds of her blanket. The sudden, frantic need to straighten her already perfect sleeve cuffs seized her, a nervous tic that had grown alarmingly frequent. "That makes sense. It's too dangerous on the ice," she replied, her voice sounding thin and brittle to her own ears. Victor finally paused his work. He set the polishing cloth aside and rested his large, calloused hands on his knees. He looked up at her, his dark eyes reflecting the dancing flames, but the expression within them was shadowed by a heavy, sorrowful comprehension. "You have not turned a single page of your book in an hour, Hermione," he noted softly. She flinched, glancing down at the heavy tome resting forgotten on her lap. The tooth of old parchment suddenly seemed mocking, a reminder of the academic focus she had completely abandoned. "I'm just tired, Victor. The altitude, the cold, it's draining." "Is it the cold?" he asked, the gentle inquiry carrying the weight of a jarring impact. He did not push, he did not demand, but the quiet dignity in his posture made her feel incredibly small. "Or is it the storm inside the castle?" A tremor ran through her jaw. She wanted to lie. She wanted to throw her arms around him, bury her face in his shoulder, and swear that he was the only thing that mattered. But the words turned to ash in her throat. The trust he offered was a pristine, fragile glass, and she could feel herself cracking it simply by existing in this state of agonizing indecision. "I don't know," she whispered, the confession tearing out of her. It was the only truth she could muster. Victor held her gaze for a long, agonizing moment before he nodded once, a slow, resigned motion. He stood up, his massive frame blocking the heat of the fire, and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to the crown of her head. "Rest, then," he murmured, his voice lacking its usual vibrant warmth. He turned and walked away, the hollow echo of his heavy boots against the stone floor sounding like the tolling of a very distant, very final bell. The chill of his absence seeped into her bones, but it was quickly overshadowed by a different, entirely terrifying anticipation for the alchemy dungeons the next morning. The lower levels of Durmstrang were steeped in a damp, oppressive gloom. The walls wept with condensation, and the air was thick with the scent of ozone after a hex, lingering from centuries of volatile experiments, mixed with the sharp, bitter odor of crushed asphodel and copper. Professor Vane stood at the front of the cavernous, vaulted laboratory, his severe features illuminated by the emerald flames roaring beneath a massive central cauldron. "The blood-mending elixir," Vane announced, his voice slicing through the damp air. "You have translated the theory. Today, you prove you can survive the practice. The brewing requires absolute magical synchronization. A single hesitation, a single misaligned magical signature, and the concoction will turn into a corrosive acid that will melt the flesh from your bones. To your cauldrons, with your assigned translation partners." Hermione's stomach plummeted. She walked toward the heavy, iron-wrought workstation near the back of the dungeon, her steps stiff and mechanical. Draco was already there. He was meticulously arranging the silver instruments on the dark slate counter. He had discarded his outer robes, leaving him in a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled precisely to his elbows. The stark, pale skin of his forearms was exposed, though he stood at a rigid angle that deliberately hid his left arm from view. His jaw was clenched so tightly she could see the faint pulsation of a vein at his temple. As Hermione stepped to the opposite side of the workstation, the atmospheric density between them thickened into a palpable, suffocating wall. It was a heavy, sensory static that pricked at the fine hairs on her arms. "Malfoy," she greeted quietly, refusing to let the tremor in her chest bleed into her voice. He did not look up. He picked up a perfectly clean crystal phial and began scrubbing it with a linen cloth, his knuckles whitening with the sheer unnecessary force of his grip. It was a violent, obsessive motion, a physical manifestation of a mind desperately trying to bleach away its own dark stains. He was punishing the glass because he could not punish himself. "Do you have the lacewing flies?" he asked, his voice a raspy, detached monotone that sounded like it had been dragged over broken glass. "Yes," she replied, unpacking her satchel with equal, forced precision. The brewing began in a torturous, suffocating silence. The elixir demanded intense focus, requiring them to constantly monitor the temperature and color of the bubbling liquid. They moved around each other in a carefully choreographed dance of avoidance. Yet, despite their best efforts, the confined space of the workstation forced a gravitational drag that was impossible to ignore. Every time he reached across the table for a brass scale, the heat radiating from his arm washed over her. Every time she leaned in to check the consistency of the crushed moonseed, she caught the faint, intoxicating scent of cedar and peppermint that clung to his skin, cutting fiercely through the acrid fumes of the dungeon. "The temperature is peaking," Hermione warned, her eyes fixed on the violently bubbling crimson liquid. "It needs the stabilizing stir, counterclockwise, exactly 7 times, while the powdered silver is added." "I know the procedure, Granger," Draco muttered, his silver eyes fixed intensely on the cauldron. He picked up the heavy glass stirring rod. "Pour the silver on my mark." Hermione lifted the vial of shimmering powder, holding her breath. The ambient magic in the room was crackling, the volatile nature of the potion feeding off the raw kinetic interference radiating between the two brewers. "Now," he commanded. She tilted the vial, but as the first flakes of silver hit the boiling surface, the liquid violently rebelled. A sharp, hissing crack split the air, and the crimson potion surged upward, turning a toxic, vibrant violet, boiling over the iron rim in a sudden, explosive wave of scalding heat. Hermione froze, her mind instantly calculating the failure, but her body remained entirely paralyzed by the sudden, violent eruption. Draco did not freeze. With blinding, predatory speed, he dropped the glass rod and lunged across the corner of the table. His hand clamped around her waist, his fingers digging fiercely into the fabric of her robes. The jarring impact of his body slamming into hers knocked the breath from her lungs as he yanked her backward, bodily dragging her out of the path of the corrosive spray. The boiling liquid hit the stone floor where she had been standing an instant before, immediately eating through the ancient rock with a vicious, hissing smoke. Hermione stumbled against his chest. Draco's other arm came around her shoulders, completely enveloping her in a cage of solid muscle and desperate heat. The world narrowed to the sudden, overwhelming reality of his physical form pressed flawlessly against her back. The sensory overload was absolute. She could feel the erratic, thunderous pounding of his heart through the thin cotton of his shirt. His breath hitched, a ragged, terrified gasp that brushed the sensitive shell of her ear. For 3 suspended, agonizing heartbeats, they stood locked together in the shadows of the dungeon. The trust she had been denying herself flooded her veins. In the split second of danger, his instinct had not been to flee, but to shield her with his own body. The visceral alignment of his chest rising and falling against her spine felt like a lock clicking perfectly into place. Slowly, her hands reached up, her trembling fingers wrapping over the pale, tense forearm that held her waist. His skin was feverishly hot. The moment she touched him, a violent jolt shot through Draco's frame. The emotional reversal was instantaneous and brutal. He tore his arms away from her, as if her touch had burned through to his bones. The withdrawal was so sudden, Hermione nearly lost her footing. He stumbled backward, putting the heavy wooden stool between them, his chest heaving as he stared at her. The vulnerability that had cracked wide open in his eyes was instantly sealed shut behind a terrifying, impenetrable wall of ice. "Keep your mind on the work, Granger," he spat, his voice trembling with a ferocious, poorly concealed panic. He turned away from her, gripping the edge of the slate counter, his knuckles stark white. "If you want to end up in the hospital wing, do it on your own time. I will not fail this term because you are incapable of following basic instructions." The words were a calculated cruelty, designed to push her as far away as possible. But the atmospheric pressure in the room told a completely different story. Hermione stood perfectly still, the ghost of his arms still burning like a brand across her ribs. She looked at the rigid line of his back, the tense set of his shoulders, and the way his hands shook against the stone counter. He was retreating into the cold, punishing himself for the brief, terrifying lapse into warmth. The conflict within her solidified, shifting from a passive guilt to a sharp, undeniable realization. The wall he was building wasn't out of hatred. It was built out of absolute, paralyzing fear. And heaven help her, she was going to tear it down. The frost creeping up the narrow, arched windows of the Durmstrang Great Hall was thick enough to obscure the jagged peaks outside, sealing the students in a claustrophobic globe of flickering candlelight and heavy, shadowed stone. The ensuing 48 hours after the incident in the alchemy dungeons had fundamentally altered the atmospheric pressure surrounding Hermione Granger. She sat at the long mahogany table, pushing a piece of dark rye bread around her pewter plate, her mind miles away from the low, rumbling conversations of the Bulgarian students surrounding her. She was no longer merely surviving the tension, she was analyzing it. The terror she had witnessed in Draco Malfoy's eyes, the visceral, agonizing panic that had violently eclipsed his mask of indifference, was a revelation that refused to let her sleep. He had saved her. He had crossed a physical and emotional chasm to shield her from the corrosive potion, only to brutally punish himself for the transgression of touching her. The phantom heat of his chest against her spine lingered like a brand, a permanent static humming beneath her skin that made every interaction with the world feel slightly out of focus. Beside her, Victor sat in silence. He had not touched his goblet of mead. The comfortable, easy warmth that usually radiated from him had cooled into a respectful yet undeniable distance. The trust he had so openly extended was fraying, not because of anything she had said, but because of everything she wasn't saying. "You are staring at the Slytherin table again," Victor noted, his voice a low vibration that barely carried over the clatter of silver cutlery. He did not turn his head to look at her, his dark eyes fixed firmly on the headmaster's empty chair at the high table. Hermione's breath hitched. A sudden, frantic need to straighten her already perfect sleeve cuffs seized her, her fingers hastily smoothing the dark wool of her uniform over her wrists. She tore her gaze away from the far end of the room, her cheeks burning with the flush of a thief caught in the act. "I wasn't staring," she murmured, the lie tasting like ash on her tongue. "Hermione," Victor sighed, a heavy, weary sound that carried the weight of a jarring impact against her conscience. He finally turned to face her. There was no anger in his expression, only a quiet, devastating clarity. A seeker knows when the snitch has changed direction, even if he cannot see it. The air shifts. You are sitting beside me, but you have not been at this table for 2 days. She swallowed hard, her throat painfully tight. "Victor, I am trying." "I know," he replied softly, his large hand briefly covering hers. The tactile friction of his calloused skin was grounding, but it lacked the magnetic pull that currently ruled her every waking thought. But you cannot force the current of a river to run backward simply because it is safe. If you are fighting a battle in your mind, you must figure out who you are truly fighting for. I will not be a shield you use to hide from your own shadow." He slowly withdrew his hand, stood up from the bench, and offered a perfectly measured formal nod before turning his back and walking out of the great hall. The hollow echo of his heavy boots against the stone floor amplified the cavernous emptiness expanding in her chest. She was hurting a good man to avoid facing a broken one. The realization crystallized, sharp and unforgiving. Hermione lifted her chin, her Gryffindor courage finally severing the tethers of her paralysis. She stood up, her chair scraping softly against the floorboards, and bypassed the grand staircase leading to the foreign dormitories. Instead, she let her instincts and the faint, lingering scent of the tooth of old parchment and peppermint guide her deep into the northern wing. She found him in the disused astronomy observation deck. It was a circular, open-air turret exposed to the brutal northern elements, entirely devoid of witchlight or heating charms. The wind whipped mercilessly through the stone arches, carrying the metallic bite of snow and the sharp scent of ozone after a hex. Draco stood near the outer balustrade, his back to the archway. He was completely unprotected against the freezing gale, wearing only his dark trousers and a thin white button-down shirt that clung to his rigid shoulders. His left arm was pressed tightly against his abdomen, an unconscious, defensive posture, while his right hand gripped the icy stone of the railing. Even from 10 paces away, she could see the violent whitening of his knuckles. "You're going to freeze to death," Hermione said, her voice piercing the howl of the wind. He went entirely still. He did not turn around, but the atmospheric pressure in the turret immediately spiked, condensing into a thick, unbreathable weight. "Leave, Granger," he commanded. The words were not shouted, but they carried a raspy, jagged edge, like sheared glass scraping against rock. She stepped further into the turret, the cold immediately biting through her thick woolen cloak, yet she barely felt it. The magnetic pull of his presence was an overwhelming force, dragging her forward. "No. I am entirely finished with running away every time you decide the world is too much to bear." "I told you to leave," he repeated, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating warning. "And I told you no." She closed half the distance between them, her boots clicking sharply against the frost-covered stone. "You saved me in the dungeon. You risked your own skin to pull me away from the cauldron. And then you looked at me as if I were a curse you were trying to break. I want to know why." Draco's chest heaved with a massive, jagged inhale. He turned slowly, the shadows of the turret clinging to the sharp angles of his face. The aristocratic mask he usually wore was completely shattered. His eyes were wide, silver pools of raw, unadulterated torment. He looked starved, hollowed out by a war he was fighting entirely within the confines of his own skull. "Because you are a curse," he breathed, the admission tearing from his throat in a ragged whisper. He took a step toward her, entirely stripped of his defenses. The heat radiating from his body warred violently with the glacial air. "You are a constant, blinding interference in a mind I have spent 2 years trying to empty. Every time I look at you, every time you breathe near me, I forget how to keep the dark out." Hermione's heart hammered a frantic, bruising rhythm against her ribs. She didn't retreat. She stood her ground, looking up into the storm raging in his eyes. The visceral alignment of their bodies standing mere feet apart in the freezing isolation of the tower, felt absolute and inescapable. "Then let it in," she whispered, her voice trembling, not from the cold, but from the sheer, terrifying magnitude of what she was offering. Draco flinched violently, as if her words were a physical strike. He raised his right hand, pressing the sharp bite of a silver ring against his own temple, an agonizing, self-inflicted grounding mechanism to keep from reaching out to her. "You don't know what you're saying," he rasped, his eyes darting frantically to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. "You see someone who pulled you out of the way of a spilled potion. You don't see the things that live in my head. You don't see the blood on my hands, Granger. If I let you close, if I let myself have even a fraction of this." He choked on the word, his jaw clenching so hard she heard his teeth grind. "I will infect you. I will drag you down into the ice where I belong." "I have my own scars, Malfoy," she countered fiercely, stepping directly into his personal space. The scent of cedar and ozone washed over her, intoxicating and entirely overwhelming. "I am not a fragile thing made of glass. Stop making decisions for me. Stop punishing yourself by pushing away the only warmth in this god-forsaken castle." She reached out. It was a slow, deliberate movement. Her trembling fingers bridged the agonizing gap between them, bypassing his rigid posture, and laid flat against the center of his chest, right over his violently racing heart. The tactile friction of her palm against the thin cotton of his shirt sent a massive, visible shockwave through his entire frame. Draco gasped, a broken, desperate sound. For one suspended, infinite second, the tension shattered into absolute surrender. He leaned down, his forehead dropping heavily against hers. The heat of his skin was a staggering contrast to the freezing wind. He squeezed his eyes shut, his entire body trembling as he breathed her in, his hands hovering millimeters above her waist, desperate to hold her, but completely terrified to close the grip. It was a moment of profound, undeniable warmth. The war was over. He was yielding. And then the memory of his own darkness struck him. The emotional shift was instantaneous and brutal. A sudden, violent shudder ripped through his spine. He tore his head away, his eyes flying open to reveal a glacial, unyielding panic. He shoved her backward, not hard enough to hurt, but with enough forceful desperation to sever the physical connection entirely. Hermione stumbled, her back hitting the stone archway. The air was sucked out of her lungs, not from the impact, but from the sudden, freezing void where his heat had just been. Draco backed away from her, his chest heaving, his face wiped entirely blank of the vulnerability he had just shown. The iron doors of his occlumency slammed shut with a deafening, invisible finality. He looked at her as if she were a stranger, his posture perfectly rigid, the mask firmly secured. "Do not ever touch me again," he stated, his voice devoid of any inflection, a dead, empty sound that chilled her far deeper than the northern wind. He didn't wait for her response. He turned on his heel and disappeared into the shadowed stairwell, the hollow echo of his rapid descent, fading into the dark, leaving Hermione alone in the biting cold, her hand still hovering in the empty air where his heart had just been beating against her palm. The silence that followed Victor Crumb's departure was not empty. It was a dense, suffocating weight that settled over Hermione's shoulders like a leaden cloak. The blizzard outside the frosted windows of the Durmstrang East Wing had finally broken, leaving behind a landscape entombed in blinding, merciless white. She sat alone in the stone alcove, the heavy velvet drapery doing little to ward off the glacial draught seeping through the ancient mortar. Their final conversation had been agonizingly brief. Victor had not shouted. He had not demanded explanations or levied accusations of betrayal. His quiet dignity had been far more devastating. He had simply looked at her, his dark eyes tracing the dark circles of exhaustion beneath her own, and softly stated that he would not anchor a ship that was desperately trying to sail into a storm. When he walked away, the hollow echo of his heavy boots fading down the vacant corridor marked the definitive end of her sanctuary. She had severed her tie to the only safe harbour in this brutal foreign fortress. She was entirely untethered now. She had chosen the terrifying, unpredictable current over the calm shallows. And the tragedy of her choice was that the current was actively trying to drown her. For the next 4 days, Draco Malfoy's avoidance was absolute. It was a masterclass in psychological warfare, executed with chilling, aristocratic precision. He became a phantom in the labyrinthine halls of the Institute. When they were forced into the same lecture theatres or dining halls, he constructed an impenetrable fortress of ice around himself. He did not sneer. He did not offer cutting remarks. He simply eradicated her from his plane of existence. Yet, the deliberate nature of his ignoring her only amplified the heavy gravitational shift whenever they occupied the same room. It was a suffocating atmospheric pressure that made it difficult for Hermione to draw a full breath. She watched him from the periphery of her vision, noting the rapid physical degradation of his carefully maintained facade. The shadows beneath his silver eyes had deepened into bruised purple crescents. The stark line of his jaw was sharper, hollowed out by a starvation that had nothing to do with the lavish feasts served in the great hall. During a practical demonstration in transfiguration, she noticed the tendons in his wrist pulling painfully taut, a subtle, violent tremor in his wand hand that he swiftly masked by gripping the edge of his desk. He was breaking apart from the inside. His silence was a self-inflicted wound, a brutal punishment for the brief, catastrophic moment he had allowed himself to yield on the astronomy tower. Hermione's own resolve was fraying under the strain of his rejection. The command he had issued, "Do not ever touch me again," reverberated in her skull every time she saw him, a constant, grating static that left her completely exhausted. She spent her evenings aggressively tracing the rim of her inkwell in the library, her quill abandoned, her mind endlessly replaying the memory of his frantic, racing heart beneath her palm. The phantom heat of his chest was a persistent burn against her skin, a cruel contrast to the bitter ambient chill of the northern stronghold. The eve of the traditional winter solstice gala arrived with a flurry of chaotic energy. The Durmstrang students were animated, transforming the austere castle with enchanted garlands of silver pine and thousands of levitating crystalline spheres that refracted the pale witchlight into dazzling prisms. Seeking to escape the suffocating festivity, Hermione retreated to the deepest, most isolated level of the subterranean archives. This section of the library was a graveyard of forgotten magic. The air here was entirely stagnant, carrying the dry rustle of decaying bindings and the sharp copper scent of raw, dormant energy. The narrow aisles were cloaked in heavy shadows, illuminated only by the weak, sputtering flame of the single brass lantern she carried. She was looking for an advanced text on arithmetic resonance, desperate for a complex academic puzzle to occupy her spiraling thoughts. Hermione set a lantern down on a nearby pen. Tall silver cool. Hermione set her lantern down on a nearby reading plinth and dragged a heavy wooden step stool to the base of the shelves. The wood groaned under her weight as she climbed the 2 steps, stretching her arm upward. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the book, but the leather was slick with centuries of undisturbed dust. She pushed up onto her toes, straining her reach. As her fingers closed around the thick spine, the stool beneath her feet violently shifted. A loose floorboard gave way with a sharp, echoing crack. Hermione gasped, her balance evaporating instantly as the stool tipped backward. She let go of the book, her hands flailing to catch the iron frame of the shelf, bracing for the harsh impact against the unforgiving stone floor. The impact never came. Instead, a sudden kinetic interference altered her trajectory completely. 2 arms wrapped around her waist with predatory speed, halting her fall with a jarring, absolute force. The breath was knocked from her lungs as her back collided flush against a solid, unyielding chest. The lantern flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the aisle, but Hermione did not need light to know who had caught her. The sheer, overwhelming magnetic pull of his proximity hit her system like a tidal wave. The crisp, intoxicating scent of cedar and peppermint instantly overpowered the dusty gloom of the archives. Draco's chest heaved against her spine. His hands, gripping her waist to keep her upright, were trembling so violently that the vibration travelled directly into her own bones. He had dropped his wand to catch her. It clattered loudly onto the stones a few feet away. For a suspended, breathless eternity, neither of them moved. The visceral alignment of their bodies in the suffocating darkness of the aisle was a devastating contradiction to the agonizing distance of the past 4 days. The heat radiating from him was a searing brand, melting through the thick wool of her robes. "Malfoy," she whispered, her voice a fragile, shattered thread in the quiet. The sound of his name was the trigger. The emotional reversal hit him with terrifying speed. He ripped his hands away from her waist, as though the fabric of her uniform had suddenly turned to molten lead. He stumbled backward, his shoulder slamming hard against the opposite bookcase. The heavy iron shelves rattled, a shower of dust drifting down through the amber light. Hermione spun around, her heart hammering a frantic, bruising rhythm against her ribs. Draco looked completely feral. The aristocratic mask was entirely obliterated, leaving behind a portrait of raw, unchecked panic. His silver eyes were wide, blown out and dark with an intoxicating mixture of starvation and terror. He was breathing in short, jagged gasps, his hands curled into tight fists at his sides. The silver signet ring on his right hand bit deeply into his own flesh, a desperate attempt to anchor his fracturing mind. "I told you," he rasped, his voice tearing out of his throat, raw and bleeding. "I told you to stay away from me." "I am in a library, Draco. I didn't summon you here," she fired back, the use of his first name slipping out before she could stop it. It hung in the heavy air between them, a dangerous, intimate spark. He flinched, the tendons in his neck pulling tight. He stared at her, his chest rising and falling erratically. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a precipice, staring down into an abyss he was violently terrified of falling into, yet entirely unable to look away from. "You shouldn't be down here alone," he muttered, deflecting, his gaze darting to the shadows beyond the lantern light. He bent down, his movements stiff and uncoordinated, and snatched his wand from the floor. "The wards in this sector are unstable." "And what are you doing down here?" she challenged, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. The fear of his rejection was entirely eclipsed by the fierce, undeniable certainty that he was lying to himself. "Following me to make sure I don't fall off a stool?" "Don't flatter yourself, Granger," he spat, but the venom in his tone was weak, entirely undermined by the way he subconsciously leaned toward her as she stepped closer. "You are exhausted," she said softly, dropping the defensive hostility. She looked at the dark, bruised skin under his eyes, the hollows of his cheeks. The need to reach out, to smooth the deep crease of torment between his brows, was an agonizing physical ache in her fingertips. "You are tearing yourself apart just to prove a point that doesn't exist." "You know nothing about what exists inside my head," he warned, his voice dropping to a lethal, vibrating register. He raised his chin, a final, desperate attempt to resurrect the icy barrier between them. "I am a Malfoy. You are a Muggle-born war heroine who just broke the heart of the most celebrated wizard in Europe. There is no reality where this—" He gestured vaguely between them, his hand shaking. "Where whatever this is does not end in absolute ruin." "I don't care about the optics of the wizarding world," Hermione stated fiercely, closing the remaining distance between them. She was standing mere inches from him now, trapped in the narrow aisle between the towering shelves. The atmospheric pressure was so dense, it felt like walking through deep water. "I care that you look at me like I am the only source of light in this castle, and then you treat me like I am the plague." Draco's eyes squeezed shut. A low, broken sound escaped his lips. He pressed his back harder against the iron shelf, trying to put space between them, but there was nowhere left to run. "If I let myself have you," he whispered, his eyes opening, burning with a devastating, naked vulnerability, "I will corrupt you. The things I've done, the things I've seen, they don't wash off, Hermione." The sound of her name on his lips was a kinetic shockwave. It shattered the last remaining fragment of her hesitation. "Then let me be dirty," she breathed out. Draco froze. The world ceased to spin. Before he could process the sheer, reckless magnitude of her words, Hermione reached up. She didn't touch his chest this time. She reached higher, her trembling fingers sinking into the soft, pale hair at the nape of his neck. The tactile friction of her skin against his was the catalyst that finally broke him. With a ragged, desperate groan, Draco's hands flew up, tangling fiercely in the heavy wool of her cloak. He didn't push her away. He dragged her violently against him. The impact was absolute. His mouth crashed down onto hers with a starving, bruising intensity. Gasped against his mouth, entirely gasped against his mouth, entirely consumed by the blinding heat of him. Her hands slid to his shoulders, gripping the fabric of his shirt to anchor herself against the overwhelming sensory overload. Draco's arms wrapped around her like iron bands, pulling her so tightly against his chest she could feel the frantic, thunderous beating of his heart perfectly mirroring her own. He kissed her as if she were oxygen, and he had been drowning for years, his mouth moving over hers with a frantic, punishing need that chased away every lingering shadow in the cold, ancient library. The air in the subterranean archives did not just turn warm, it ignited. The kiss was a frantic, desperate reclamation, a violent collision of two souls who had spent months navigating a frozen wasteland only to find a son buried beneath the earth. Draco's hands, previously so hesitant, were now iron shackles, pulling Hermione into him as if he could merge their very atoms. He backed her into the towering ironwood shelves, the ancient wood groaning behind her, but she felt no impact, only the overwhelming, searing reality of his body. His mouth was a storm, unyielding, starving, and laced with a jagged vulnerability that made her chest ache. He tasted of the northern winter and the sharp peppermint he used to mask his lack of sleep. But beneath it all was something purely Draco, a metallic, electric tang of high-voltage magic. Hermione's fingers tangled deeper into the silk of his hair, her nails grazing his scalp, and a low, broken sound vibrated through his throat and into hers. It was the sound of a man finally surrendering a war he never wanted to fight. When he finally tore his mouth away, he didn't pull back. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, his breath hitching in ragged, terrifying gasps. His entire frame was trembling, a violent shudder that he could no longer suppress with occlumency or silver rings. "I can't," he rasped into her skin, his voice a shattered ghost of its former arrogance. "Hermione, I can't stop. If I stay here, if I keep doing this, there will be nothing left of the girl you are. I'm a void. I'm a black hole." "Then let me be the light that gets trapped," she whispered fiercely, her hands framing his face, forcing him to look at her. His silver eyes were dilated, the irises thin rings around vast, dark pupils. In the flickering amber glow of the fallen lantern, he looked like a tragic figure from a Durmstrang legend, a prince of ice melting under a touch he didn't believe he deserved. He leaned his forehead against hers, his eyes closing in a brief, agonizing moment of peace. The atmospheric pressure in the archives had shifted from suffocating to sacred. "They will destroy you for this," he murmured, his thumb tracing the curve of her lower lip, which was now flushed and swollen from his touch. "Your friends, your world. They won't understand why the Golden Girl chose a Death Eater in a frozen fortress." "Let them try," she countered, the Gryffindor fire in her blood rising to meet his fear. "I am tired of living for their expectations, Draco. I am tired of being the sensible one. I choose this. I choose you." The use of his name, spoken with such unwavering certainty, seemed to act as a physical balm. The rigid tension in his shoulders finally, truly dissipated. He didn't pull away this time. He simply held her, his arms wrapped around her waist, his chin resting on top of her head. For the first time since they had arrived at the Institute, the silence wasn't heavy with unspoken threats. It was full. but the world outside their hidden alcove did not cease to exist. The distant chime of the castle clock tower echoed through the stone floors, a deep, resonant tolling that signaled the beginning of the winter solstice gala. Draco stiffened. The reality of their situation rushed back in, cold and unforgiving. He stepped back, though he kept his hands on her upper arms, his grip firm as if anchoring her. "The gala," he said, his voice regaining a fraction of its composure, though his eyes remained raw. "Vane expects us there. If we don't show, the rumors will start before the first dance ends. And after what happened with Crumb." "I know," Hermione said, smoothing the front of her robes. She felt a sudden, frantic need to straighten her already perfect sleeve cuffs, but she caught herself. She didn't need the habit anymore. She looked at Draco, who was already meticulously buttoning his collar, the mask sliding back into place with practiced, heartbreaking ease. "We have to go." "We go separately," Draco commanded, though his eyes softened the blow. "I'll head to the Great Hall through the Northern Transit. You take the main library exit. If anyone asks, you were looking for research on the solstice rituals. And if they ask why my eyes look like I've been crying," she asked, a small, sad smile playing on her lips. Draco reached out, his fingers brushing a stray curl away from her temple. His touch was no longer a violation, it was a promise. "Tell them the dust in the archives is as old as the mountains. It tends to irritate the eyes." He turned to leave, but stopped at the edge of the lantern's reach. He looked back at her, his silhouette sharp against the darkness. "Hermione." "Yes?" "Don't wear your hair up tonight," he said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate hum. "I want to see it down." He vanished into the shadows before she could reply. Hermione stood in the silence for a long moment, her heart still racing a mile a minute. She picked up her lantern, the flame now steady and bright, and began the long climb back to the upper levels of the castle. The great hall had been transformed. The dark mahogany and wrought iron were draped in shimmering, enchanted ice lilies that glowed with a soft, ethereal light. The floor had been polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the thousands of floating candles above. The air was thick with the scent of pine, expensive wine, and the floral perfume of the visiting delegations. Music, played by an orchestra of enchanted violins, swelled through the room, a haunting minor key waltz that felt more like a ritual than a celebration. Hermione entered through the grand oak doors, her heart lodged in her throat. She had followed his request. Her hair fell in a wild chestnut cascade over her shoulders, pinned back only by a simple silver clip. She wore her dress robes of deep midnight blue, a colour that felt like a quiet rebellion against the stark reds and blacks of Durmstrang. The room went quiet for a fraction of a second as she moved toward the centre of the hall. She felt the weight of hundreds of gazes. She saw Victor across the room, standing with a group of Durmstrang seniors. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, before he turned back to his conversation. The sting was there, but it was dull, eclipsed by the magnetic pull she felt coming from the far side of the room. Draco was standing near the refreshments, a crystal flute of champagne in his hand. He was dressed in formal black robes of the finest acromantula silk, his family signet ring gleaming under the candlelight. He was surrounded by Knot and Pansy Parkinson, but he looked entirely solitary. As Hermione passed him on her way to join the Hogwarts group, their eyes met. It was a jarring impact. The silver in his gaze was no longer cold. It was a molten, liquid heat. He didn't smile. That would be too much. But he dipped his head in a nearly imperceptible nod. The atmospheric pressure in the hall seemed to compress, creating a private tunnel between them that no one else could enter. "You look different, Hermione," Ginny Weasley whispered as she reached her side. Ginny was looking at her with a keen, observant squint. "Did you find what you were looking for in the library?" "I found a great deal more than I expected," Hermione replied, her voice steady despite the chaos in her veins. The evening progressed in a blur of formal dances and stilted conversation. Hermione moved through the motions like a ghost, her mind constantly tethered to the boy in the black robes. She watched him move across the floor, his grace predatory and elegant. She saw the way he avoided her, the way he kept his distance with surgical precision, and she knew it was for her protection. But as the clock neared midnight, the peak of the solstice, the formal pretenses began to fray. The music grew faster, more primal. The students began to move toward the outdoor balcony for the traditional lighting of the ice torches. In the confusion of the crowd moving toward the doors, Hermione felt a hand brush against her arm. A small, folded slip of parchment was pressed into her palm. She didn't look down until she was safely tucked into a stone alcove near the exit. The West Tower. The battlements. 5 minutes. She didn't hesitate. She slipped away from the throng of students, her boots silent on the stone as she hurried through the darkened corridors. The West Tower was the highest point of the fortress, an ancient, wind-swept spire that looked out over the frozen sea. When she reached the top, the wind was howling, a fierce, icy gale that threatened to steal her breath. But she didn't feel the cold. Draco was waiting for her, leaning against the crenellated wall. He had discarded his formal outer cloak, standing once again in just his silk robes. He looked like a king of a fallen empire, beautiful and broken against the backdrop of the northern stars. "You came," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I told you I wasn't running anymore," she replied, walking toward him. He didn't wait for her to reach him. He met her halfway, his hands coming up to grip her waist, pulling her flush against him. The contrast between the freezing air and the heat of his body was staggering. "I can't do the gala anymore, Hermione," he murmured, his face inches from hers. "I can't stand there and pretend I don't want to burn the whole world down just to be alone with you." "Then don't pretend," she said, her heart soaring. Draco's eyes searched hers, looking for any hint of doubt, any flicker of regret. Finding none, his expression shifted into something raw and beautiful. He leaned down, his mouth hovering just over hers. "The solstice is the longest night of the year," he whispered, his breath warm against her lips. "But it's also the night the light starts to come back." He kissed her then, and it was different from the library. It wasn't a desperate collision. It was a slow, deep claim. It was the kiss of two survivors finding land after a shipwreck. The wind roared around them, and the ice torches flared to life in the courtyard below, casting a flickering orange glow up the side of the tower. But they were lost in their own heat. Two stars colliding in the dark of the northern sky. The morning following the solstice was a revelation of blinding, merciless white. The blizzard had passed, leaving the Durmstrang fortress encased in a layer of frost, so thick it looked as though the castle had been carved from a single gargantuan diamond. Inside, however, the atmosphere was anything but crystalline. The aftermath of the gala hummed through the corridors, a mixture of hungover exhaustion and the sharp electric gossip that always followed a night of ritual and revelry. Hermione sat in the great hall, her fingers wrapped around a steaming mug of black tea. She was hyper-aware of every sound, the scrape of a fork, the low murmur of the Durmstrang students, the rustle of the morning owls. Her skin felt too thin, as if the heat from the West Tower was still radiating outward, threatening to melt the very floorboards beneath her. She did not look toward the Slytherin table. She did not need to. The magnetic pull was so strong she could feel exactly where Draco was in the room. A cold, sharp pressure against the back of her neck, a static charge that told her he was sitting rigidly, likely not eating, his eyes fixed on some distant, invisible point. "You're doing it again," a voice whispered beside her. Hermione jumped, nearly slopping her tea onto her robes. Ginny was watching her, her expression no longer just curious, but deeply concerned. The redhead leaned in, lowering her voice until it was a mere breath against the ambient noise. "Hermione, people are talking. They saw you leave the gala. They saw him leave right after. And Victor, he looks like he's seen a ghost." "I was in the library, Ginny," Hermione said, the lie feeling like a heavy stone in her stomach. "I told you, I needed to check a reference for the arithmancy project." "In the dark, without your cloak?" Ginny's eyes narrowed. "I'm your friend, not your prefect. But this isn't like you. You're playing with a kind of fire that doesn't just burn, Hermione. It consumes. If Vane finds out, or worse, if word gets back to the Ministry..." "I can handle myself," Hermione snapped, the sudden spike of defensiveness catching them both off guard. She took a steadying breath, her fingers instinctively reaching for her sleeve cuffs before she forced them to remain still on the table. "I'm sorry. It's complicated." "It's Malfoy," Ginny said flatly. "It's not complicated. It's dangerous." Hermione didn't answer. She couldn't. How could she explain that the danger was the only thing that made her feel alive in this frozen tomb? How could she explain that the boy they all saw as a villain was the only one who had looked at her and seen a person, not a symbol or a prize? The confrontation she had been dreading arrived 2 hours later in the alchemy dungeons. Professor Vane was in a foul mood, his patience eroded by the previous night's festivities. The air in the lab was thick with the scent of sulphur and dunderhead failure. "The final phase of the blood-mending rites," Vane announced, his voice echoing off the damp stone walls. "The integration. Today, you will not be brewing. You will be casting. You will bind your magical signatures to the potion you created, stabilizing the volatile core with your own intent. If your intent is fractured, the potion will fail. If your partner's intent is discordant, the potion will explode. Begin." Hermione walked to the workstation. Draco was already there, his back to the room. He was wearing his heavy, fur-lined Durmstrang cloak today, the collar turned up to hide his face. As she approached, he didn't turn. He was staring into the cauldron of crimson liquid they had managed to save during the last lesson. "The resonance must be perfect, Malfoy," she said, her voice low and steady. "I know," he rasped. He finally looked at her, and the impact was enough to make her knees weak. His eyes were bloodshot, the silver irises practically glowing against the dark circles of fatigue. He looked like a man who had spent the night staring into the sun. "My intent is clear. Is yours?" "Always," she replied. They drew their wands in unison. The task required them to cross their magical streams over the center of the cauldron, weaving a complex lattice of golden and silver light that would sink into the liquid and bind it. It was a feat of extreme synchronization, a literal merging of their magical essences. As the first sparks left her wand, Hermione felt the connection. It wasn't the clean, academic click she usually felt during spellwork. It was a visceral, violent roar. The moment her magic touched his, the atmospheric pressure in the dungeon plummeted. The emerald flames beneath the cauldron turned a blinding, brilliant white. "Focus," she told herself. "Don't let him in. Just the magic." But it was impossible. Through the link, she felt him. She felt the crushing weight of his guilt, the sharp, jagged edges of his fear, and the overwhelming, starving heat of his need for her. It was a torrential downpour of emotion that threatened to sweep her away. And in return, he was feeling her fierce protectiveness, her defiance, and the quiet, aching love that she hadn't yet dared to name. The potion began to glow, the crimson shifting into a luminous, pulsing gold. The other students in the room stopped their work, staring at the workstation at the back of the room. The air was crackling with ozone, the scent of cedar and peppermint filling the lab. "Steady," Draco groaned, his arm shaking with the effort of holding the stream. "It's too much. The resonance is too high." "Don't pull back," Hermione cried, her eyes locked onto his. "If you break the connection now, it will kill us both. Hold on to me." She wasn't talking about the magic anymore. Draco's eyes widened. He gritted his teeth, his knuckles turning white as he leaned into the light. He stopped fighting the connection and let it wash over him. The two streams of magic fused into a single, blinding pillar of white fire that shot upward, hitting the vaulted ceiling of the dungeon with a sound like a thunderclap. The cauldron settled. The liquid inside was now a perfect, clear silver, as still as a mountain lake. Silence fell over the room. Professor Vane walked forward, his eyes fixed on the silver potion. He reached out, dipping a glass rod into the liquid and lifting it. The potion clung to the glass like liquid silk, glowing with a soft inner light. "Flawless," Vane whispered, his voice tinged with a rare, genuine awe. He looked up at Hermione and Draco, his gaze lingering on the way they were both breathing in sync, their faces flushed, their eyes still locked in a silent, private conversation. "I have never seen a resonance that powerful. Not in 40 years. He turned back to the class, his face hardening again. "The rest of you, look at this. This is what happens when two magical signatures are in total alignment. This is the power of shared intent. Take your samples and get out." As the students scrambled to finish, Draco turned his back on the room, gripping the edge of the slate counter. His chest was heaving. Hermione reached out, her hand hovering just inches from his shoulder. "We did it," she whispered. "We shouldn't have," he replied, his voice a broken, hollow sound. He turned to face her, his expression one of absolute devastation. "Did you feel that, Hermione? Did you feel what we just did?" "Yes," she said, her eyes filling with tears. "It was beautiful." "No," he said, shaking his head. It was a confession. Every secret I have, every dark thought. You have it now. You've seen inside me. You know exactly what kind of monster I am. I saw a boy who was taught to hate and chose to love instead. She countered, her voice ringing with conviction. I saw someone who would rather break his own heart than let me be hurt. That's not a monster, Draco. That's a man. He stared at her, his jaw working as he fought back the urge to pull her into his arms right there in the middle of the dungeon. The conflict was written in every line of his face, the desperate need to be known and the crushing fear of being seen. I have to go, he said, his voice cracking. Vane wants the reports by dinner. I can't be near you right now. He snatched up his satchel and fled the room, his footsteps echoing like gunshots against the stone. Hermione stood alone at the workstation, the silver potion reflecting the flickering green firelight. She felt drained, emptied of everything but a single, burning truth. There were no longer two students on an exchange program. They were no longer enemies or allies. They were two halves of a whole, bound by a magic so old and so deep that no ocean or war could ever truly separate them. She took a small phial of the silver liquid and tucked it into her pocket, a reminder of the light they had created in the dark. The rest of the day passed in a surreal haze. She avoided the great hall, opting instead to walk the perimeter of the castle walls. The sun was setting, casting long violet shadows across the snow. The air was freezing, but she felt as though she were walking through a summer meadow. The connection was still there, a faint hum at the base of her skull, telling her that he was safe, that he was thinking of her, that he was just as terrified as she was. As she reached the West Tower, she saw a figure standing at the top of the stairs. It wasn't Draco. Victor Crumb was waiting for her, his arms crossed over his chest, his face shadowed by the hood of his cloak. He will never be able to give you what you need, Hermione, Victor said, his voice heavy with a profound, quiet sorrow. He is a man of shadows. You are a woman of the sun. You will burn yourself out trying to keep him warm. Maybe, Hermione said, stopping a few feet away from him. But I'd rather burn out with him than spend my life in the cold with anyone else. Victor looked at her for a long time, his eyes searching hers for any sign of hesitation. When he found none, he let out a long, slow exhale, his shoulders sagging. Then I hope the fire is worth the ash, he said softly. He stepped aside, allowing her to pass. Hermione climbed the stairs to the top of the tower, the wind whipping her hair into a frenzy. Draco was there, standing at the battlements, looking out over the frozen world. He didn't turn when she approached. He didn't have to. You're late, he said, a ghost of a smirk playing on his lips. I had to say goodbye to the light, she replied, stepping up beside him. He reached out, his hand finding hers in the dark. His fingers were cold, but his grip was sure. Welcome to the shadows, Granger. I think I'm going to like it here, she said, leaning her head against his shoulder. The stars above Durmstrang were bright and cold, but as the two of them stood there, wrapped in each other's heat, the winter didn't seem so long anymore. They were a secret written in the frost, a story of two people who found the courage to be broken together. And as the first light of the new year began to creep over the horizon, they knew that no matter what happened next, they would never have to face the dark alone again. The final week at Durmstrang felt less like a departure and more like the slow lifting of a heavy, ancient siege. The sun, though still low on the horizon, had begun to reclaim the sky for longer stretches, turning the jagged mountain peaks into spires of rose gold and honey. The atmospheric pressure that had once threatened to crush Hermione's spirit had transformed into a humming, kinetic energy, a secret shared between two people that acted as a private sun in the middle of a frozen wasteland. They met one last time in the subterranean archives. This time, there was no pretense of research, no heavy tomes of arithmancy to act as a shield. The air was still thick with the scent of the tooth of old parchment and the metallic, bitter tang of preservation spells, but the shadows no longer felt predatory. They felt like a sanctuary. Draco was waiting in the same narrow aisle where the potion had first exploded. He was leaning against the ironwood shelf, his hands shoved into the pockets of his dark trousers. He had abandoned the heavy Durmstrang furs, wearing only his Hogwarts uniform, the silver and green of his tie a sharp, vivid contrast to the pale exhaustion that still lined his face. But as Hermione approached, the mask did not slide into place. His silver eyes warmed, the irises expanding as the magnetic pull between them snapped back into existence. "The portkey leaves in an hour," he said, his voice a low, raspy vibration that echoed through the silent stacks. "I know," Hermione replied, stopping just a few inches from him. The visceral alignment of their bodies was immediate. She could feel the heat radiating from him, fighting the damp chill of the basement. Vane is already herding the others toward the courtyard. Draco reached out, his long, pale fingers brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was no longer a frantic, terrified collision. It was a slow, deliberate claim. "What happens when we land, Hermione? When the fog of this place clears and we're back in the Highlands? Your friends, the Ministry. The reality of who I am doesn't change just because we found a way to survive the ice." Hermione reached up, her hands covering his, pressing his palm firmly against her cheek. "The reality of who you were is what changed, Draco. You didn't just survive the ice, you melted it." She looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the flickering amber light of a nearby torch. "I'm not going back to the way things were. I'm not going back to being the sensible one who lives for everyone else's approval. I chose you in the dark, and I'm going to keep choosing you in the light." Draco's breath hitched, a ragged, emotional sound that he didn't try to hide. He stepped forward, closing the final gap between them, his arms wrapping around her waist with an intensity that spoke of years of starvation. He buried his face in the crook of her neck, breathing her in, peppermint, old books, and the clean scent of the northern wind. "I don't deserve this," he murmured into her skin. "I don't deserve you." "Good thing I'm not interested in what people deserve," she whispered, her fingers tangling in the soft silk of his hair. "I'm interested in what we are." He pulled back just enough to look at her, his expression a devastating portrait of raw, unadulterated devotion. The silver in his eyes was molten, swirling with a fire that had been ignited in the alchemy dungeons and forged on the West Tower battlements. He leaned down, his mouth hovering just over hers, the air between them thick with a kinetic interference that made the fine hairs on her arms stand up. "Then what are we, Hermione?" "We are the Resonance," she said. And then he kissed her. It was a kiss that contained the entirety of their shared history, the years of bitter rivalry, the sharp sting of insults, the growing, unspoken curiosity, and the final explosive surrender in the frozen north. It was deep, thorough, and entirely unhurried, a promise sealed in the shadows of a foreign school. The taste of him, cedar, ozone, and a hint of dark chocolate, filled her senses, anchoring her to the present moment. Draco's hands slid up her back, his palms hot through the wool of her robes, pulling her so close she could feel every beat of his heart against her ribs. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathless, their foreheads resting against each other in the quiet gloom. The world outside was waiting. The questions, the judgment, the difficult conversations. But for this one suspended second, they were the only two people in the universe. "See you on the other side, Granger," he whispered, a genuine, lopsided smirk finally touching his lips. "Don't be late, Malfoy," she replied, her heart soaring. The return to Hogwarts was a blur of spinning colour and the sharp, nauseating lurch of portkey travel. One moment they were standing in the biting wind of the Durmstrang courtyard, and the next they were tumbling onto the damp spring grass of the Hogwarts grounds. The air here was soft, carrying the scent of rain-soaked earth and the first hints of blooming gorse. It felt incredibly, almost unsettlingly, gentle. As the group of exchange students stood up, dusting off their robes, the divide was immediate. Harry and Ron were already running down the hill from the castle, their faces bright with relief. "Hermione!" Ron shouted, waving his arms. Hermione felt the old, familiar weight of expectation settle over her. She saw Draco standing a few yards away, his trunk beside him, his expression already beginning to shift back into the cool, aristocratic mask he wore for the world. He looked at her, a brief, sharp flash of the silver fire in his eyes, before he turned to follow the other Slytherins toward the dungeons. She watched him go for a second, the tether between them stretching but not breaking. "You okay, Hermione?" Harry asked as he reached her, pulling her into a brief, awkward hug. "You look different." "Did the Bulgarians work you too hard?" "Something like that," she said, offering a small, private smile. The first week back was a test of endurance. Hermione threw herself into her studies, but the library felt strangely empty without the heavy stone walls and the scent of northern pine. She missed the static. She missed the cold. She missed the way the atmospheric pressure changed the second a certain blonde boy entered the room. They were careful. They had to be. In the great hall they sat at their respective tables, never speaking, never looking. But the resonance was always there. It was in the way Draco would accidentally leave a rare book on a table in the library for her to find. It was in the way Hermione would leave a small phial of perfect silver potion in a hidden nook of the owlery. It was a secret language written in the margins of their lives. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday in April. Hermione was sitting in her favourite window seat in the library, the sound of the rain against the glass a soothing rhythm. She was staring at a parchment on advanced transfiguration, but her mind was miles away, back on the West Tower battlements. A shadow fell over her table. She didn't look up, her heart already knowing who it was. "The variable for the cross-species shift is miscalculated here, Granger," a low, familiar voice murmured. Hermione finally looked up. Draco was standing over her, his hands tucked into his pockets, a silver quill resting on the table next to her inkwell. He wasn't wearing his mask. He was looking at her with an openness that was bold, reckless, and entirely beautiful. Across the library, several students gasped. Madame Pince dropped a stack of books. The silence that followed was absolute, a heavy, expectant weight. "I accounted for the biological mass, Malfoy," Hermione said, her voice clear and ringing in the quiet. "You didn't factor in the soul," he countered, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. He didn't walk away. He pulled out the chair opposite her and sat down. The library erupted into a frenzy of whispers. Hermione could see Harry and Ron at a far table, their mouths hanging open in various stages of shock and horror. She could see Pansy Parkinson staring from the entrance, her eyes wide. Draco ignored them all. He leaned across the table, his silver eyes locking onto hers, the atmospheric pressure in the room shifting until it felt exactly like the archives at Durmstrang. "We're doing this?" he asked softly, the question a final check. "We're doing this," she replied, reaching across the table to take the silver quill. Her fingers brushed his, the tactile frictions sending a jolt of pure electric heat through her system. The happy ending wasn't a fairy tale of instant acceptance or a world without shadows. It was this: two people sitting at a library table, defying the history that should have kept them apart, and choosing to build something new in the wreckage. It was the knowledge that the longest night had passed, and the light was finally, irrevocably coming back. As the rain continued to fall against the glass, Hermione Granger and Draco Malfoy began to work on their next project. Not for a grade, not for a professor, but for themselves. The resonance was perfect, the synchronization was absolute, and for the first time in her life, Hermione knew exactly where she belonged. She was right where she wanted to be, in the center of the storm, holding the hand of the boy who had taught her how to dance in the rain.
Thank you for staying with me until the end. This story is about more than just magic. It is about the walls we build around our hearts. Sometimes we think the cold is safer than the fire. We think it is easier to be alone than to be hurt. But Draco and Hermione found something different. They found that even in the darkest winter, you can choose to be warm. They showed us that people can change. Your past does not have to be your future. Love is not always easy. Sometimes it is a storm, sometimes it is scary, but it is always worth the risk. I hope this story reminded you of one thing: never be afraid of your own light, and never be afraid to reach out for someone else in the dark. Until next time, see you.